hospital stood at the very edge of the old town, where eucalyptus trees grew thick, reaching even onto the rusted, peeling tin roofs. The road leading up to it had a dip on one side, always lower than the other. No one went there unless they had to, and no one left unless something was holding them there, keeping them alive. On that Tuesday morning, the fog was so thick it could have been mistaken for smoke. The rain didn't fall, but the mist hung heavy in the air, thick as gasoline fumes. Nurse Marla stood beside the bed of patient 214, a man named Daniel Keaton, who had been in a deep coma ever since he had suffered a sudden stroke. He'd been lying there, unmoving, for 6 days now. The family had signed the "do not resuscitate" order. The attending physician gently suggested, perhaps it's time to say goodbye. And so Kate Keaton, his wife, made a suggestion no one ever made in that hospital. She wanted to bring their dog. Max has never been away from Daniel for more than 3 days in 12 years. If this is the last time, he deserves to know. No one objected. Max, a graying old Labrador, calm as dust, was allowed into the ICU through a side door, on a leash and with a towel to wipe his paws. A small, unspoken ritual of the nameless hospital. Marla opened the door. Max walked in. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He just stared. A stare that made Marla take a step back, not out of fear, but because it felt like the dog knew exactly what was going on. Not in the instinctive way, more like it had been here before, had lived through this moment, had been waiting for it for a long time. Max walked to the bedside. Daniel lay still. The heart monitor beeped steadily, weak but regular. Kate stood at the head of the bed, holding Daniel's hand, the other hand resting on Max's back. "Daniel, Max came to say goodbye." Max didn't move. But then, unexpectedly, he lifted his front paw and placed it gently on the edge of the bed. A strange position. He'd never been trained to do that. Then he stretched forward and touched his nose to Daniel's left hand, the hand that hadn't moved at all. A long beep sounded on the heart monitor. Marla flinched. Kate held her breath. The heartbeat shifted. It increased slightly, unexpectedly. Then, what no one expected, Daniel's finger twitched. Once, then again. Max stepped back, sat down, silent, and Marla ran out to call the doctor. Daniel woke up 17 minutes later, still weak. His eyes barely opened, but he was aware. Kate held his hand, crying. Marla stood outside the door. Max, too. The dog didn't look in. It only stared down the hallway, as if hearing someone walking in from the past. 3 days later, Daniel was moved to the recovery room. The doctor called it an unexplainable recovery. People talked more about Max than the attending physician. A young nurse posted a short video, just 11 seconds of the dog touching its owner's hand. 4 days later, the video surpassed 1.4 million views. But what no one noticed, after that, Max wouldn't eat, wouldn't play, didn't lay in his usual spot at the foot of the bed. He just lay by the door to Daniel's room, eyes open, watching. Daniel didn't talk much after he woke up, partly because he was tired, and partly because he wasn't sure what had brought him back. In his mind, he still had a hazy dream. A long road, cornfields burned dry on either side, the sky without color. At the end of the road was something waiting. Not a person, not a door. Just emptiness. He got closer to it, and then something pulled his hand back. Not a person's hand, but a breath. A steady, heavy rhythm. Then he opened his eyes. The first night home, Daniel sat quietly on the wooden chair on the porch. Max lay at his feet, the crescent moon curved like a slash. "Do you remember?" Daniel asked, even though he knew the dog couldn't answer. But Max's gaze met his, as though to say, "I never forgot." Daniel bent down, gently stroked Max's head. His hands still trembled, but his heart didn't. It beat steadily. For the first time in nearly a week, he whispered, "You didn't come to say goodbye. You came to pull me back, didn't you?" Max didn't move, didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, just looked up, and in those eyes, Daniel knew something long forgotten, something old, that was just beginning to open inside of him. The night wind swept across the porch, creeping under the door frame, making the wind chimes ring as if someone were breathing into them. Daniel sighed, reached for his cold coffee cup, but his fingers only brushed the air. He wasn't used to the chill at his fingertips. This body, the one he'd just returned to, seemed a little slower than his memory. He wondered, where did I go? It wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell, it was a place without sound. During the coma, Daniel hadn't dreamed of light, hadn't seen his lost loved ones. Instead, he sat alone at a long wooden table. Scattered across the table were items, a scorched photograph, an old lock, and a broken wristband. No one explained, no one asked. He just sat there, waiting. It felt like waiting for himself to be chosen. Then one day, he heard a breath, very faint, from behind him, not quite human. Deep, steady, full of air, like something that had been waiting for him for a long time, and it brushed his hand. Then everything vanished. When he was healthy, Daniel had been the one to fix things. Old cars, washing machines, even the 60-cent wristwatch. He didn't like replacing things. He preferred to keep them. So, when Kate suggested they get another dog to cheer up their daughter, he refused. But Max, the stray they'd found during a storm, seemed not like an option. Max wouldn't leave Daniel from the very first day. He wouldn't lie next to anyone but him, wouldn't eat unless Daniel spoke first. And once, he had run into the road to block a sliding truck, saving Daniel from being crushed. Max broke his leg, had to wear a cast for 6 weeks. Since then, Daniel had called Max by a name only he understood, the Guardian. Max wasn't a pet. He was a part of Daniel's life, not for playing, but for keeping rhythm. At the hospital, Marla, the nurse who witnessed the moment Max placed his paw on Daniel's bed, couldn't forget that image. After her shift, she went back to the security camera footage, watched it over and over. It was still a simple act, a dog touching a person's hand. But something was off. Daniel's hand twitched just before Max touched it. Only one frame, a fraction of a second. But it was there. Marla didn't tell anyone. She just saved the video, named it Not Just a Dogma 4. Kate, the wife, also didn't sleep the night Daniel woke up. She stood in the kitchen, cutting lemon peel into strips to make marmalade. Her hands trembled. The knife nicked her pinky, but she didn't feel the pain, not because she wasn't worried, but because she didn't know whether to feel joy or fear. She knew Daniel had already died once. 7 years ago, when he nearly drowned after falling from a wooden bridge. It had been Max, the first one to jump in the water, pulling him to shore. It had been Daniel, waking up after 4 hours, not remembering why he had fallen. It had been Kate, standing silently by his bed, whispering, "Don't come back unless you're sure." That phrase no one heard, except Max, and maybe him. A week later, Daniel could sit up. He started practicing writing, his letters crooked like a child learning to hold a pencil. But he wrote steadily, the hours, the names, the fleeting images. The mirror doesn't reflect, but Max's eyes were like a mirror. I sat on this chair, but beneath my feet wasn't a rug, it was wet stone. Kate wore the green sweater the day I woke up, but it was the sweater I bought for my mother, who died 10 years ago. The notes didn't connect, but he couldn't stop writing, couldn't stop remembering. and couldn't shake the feeling there was something about Max he once knew, then forgot. On the 8th night, Max didn't sleep in his usual spot. He lay on the front porch. The wind howled, the moon was green. Daniel snuck out, wrapped himself in a blanket and sat beside him. "You pulled me back, but how many times have you done that before?" he asked softly. Max turned his head, not to answer, but to confirm the question was right. Daniel sat quietly for a long time. Then he whispered, "You didn't come to say goodbye. You never did. You only came to pull me back. Every time I strayed too far." Max raised his head, his old eyes reflecting the moon, and Daniel swore that in that moment he saw himself, a younger, thinner version looking back from within them. Inside the house, Kate stared out the window, unblinking. She had dreamed this, not once, but 3 times. Each time Daniel escaped death, she dreamed the same thing. An old wooden door, Max standing in front of it. Not barking, not moving, just standing. As if, without him, the door would open, and Daniel would never return. Daniel began to grow more aware on the 10th morning. He could sit for longer in the chair, pour his own water despite his still trembling hand. Max still followed every step, but something was different. The dog no longer just watched, it seemed to be following. Every time Daniel stood, it stood 3 paces away, no closer, no further, no wagging tail, no growling, just silently. One time, Daniel tried to enter his old office, the room he'd abandoned after his father's death. The door was ajar. When he placed his hand on the doorknob, Max let out a low growl, almost instinctively. Daniel turned back. The dog stood between him and the door. Its eyes weren't warning, nor was it afraid. It was the gaze of someone who had known what lay behind that door. He didn't move forward. He just whispered, "You don't want me to go in there, do you?" Max didn't answer, but it didn't budge. Then it turned around, walked back to the porch, and lay down, like it had finished its shift. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He pulled out his notebook, trying to recall every detail of the dream he'd had while in the coma. One part stood out more clearly than the rest. On that wooden table there'd been a scorched photograph. At first, he thought it was a family photo. But when his fingers brushed the back, he saw a faded inscription. The 3rd time. No names, no dates. Just 3 words. Daniel didn't remember ever seeing it. But those words made his chest ache. A pain that no medicine could cure, as if someone was pressing down on a memory, not letting it rise. The next day, Kate washed Daniel's old clothes. In the pocket of the coat he wore the day of the stroke, she found a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was firm, slanted. "If there's a next time, don't open the back door. Keep Max with you." No signature. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting, or at least not the one he remembered. Kate didn't say anything to Daniel, but that night she quietly locked the back door. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel completely certain the man lying beside her was the Daniel she once knew. At the hospital, Nurse Marla hadn't forgotten the video she saved. There was something about it that kept her watching. This time, she tried to slow it down with her software. When she stopped at the frame where Max touched Daniel's hand, she noticed the clock on the wall behind ticked backward. 1 frame, 1 second. The second hand ticked back a moment. No one believed it. No one saw it. But she saved another copy, renamed it Not Just a Dogmem 4. In town, rumors spread that Daniel Keaton cheated death thanks to his dog. A group of elderly churchgoers wrote asking if they could meet Max. One person even suggested adding Max to the state's therapy dog hero list. Daniel turned them all down. He didn't want Max to become a mascot. because he knew, or felt, that Max didn't need anyone's recognition. He didn't come to perform miracles. He came to hold on to something and wasn't ready to leave. One afternoon, the wind howled. Max lay at Daniel's feet on the porch. Daniel, instead of writing in his journal, took out an old photo album. There was a picture from his childhood, standing in front of the old Ford with his father and a dog, not Max, but it looked strangely similar. Black fur, a gray patch on the neck, a scar on the left ear. Daniel had never had a dog when he was a child. His father hated dogs. So why was there this picture? He asked Kate. She looked at it and said, "You never showed me this one." "I don't remember ever having it," Daniel replied softly. Max walked over, stared at the picture, didn't bark, but suddenly he shuddered, and Daniel for the first time felt maybe Max had been with him longer than just 12 years, longer than a lifetime. Daniel was no longer the man he once knew himself to be. It wasn't clear. It wasn't like pain or fatigue. It was a strange delay between thought and action, as though his body hadn't quite caught up to his mind yet. Max, still like a shadow beside him, seemed to know every step before it was taken. Every morning, when Daniel rose from bed, the dog was already standing outside his bedroom door. When Daniel reached for the kitchen doorknob, Max would turn his head. No one had taught him to do that. No one had ever taught him at all. One day, Daniel decided to alter his routine. Instead of stepping out onto the porch at 9 a.m. like usual, he tried leaving 30 minutes earlier, but Max was already there, waiting, as though it knew. Kate noticed Daniel was writing more than before. Not just a few stray lines in his journal, but full passages, deep thoughts as if he were desperately trying to grasp something slipping away. One night, after Daniel had gone to bed early, she secretly opened his notebook left on the table. In the middle of the page, he'd written, "The third rain left no trace, but I still caught a cold. Max doesn't just guard the door. He guards me." The back door once opened, but this time, I was the one who closed it. Kate didn't understand, but part of her, the part that had grown weary after the near-death incident years ago, whispered that Daniel hadn't simply come back to life. He had been allowed to return. The story of Daniel and Max spread throughout the town. A local paper called him the man saved by his dog. The church pastor came to invite Daniel to speak. He politely declined, but firmly. Daniel didn't like to be mentioned, because truthfully, he wasn't even sure if he had truly returned as the same person. One morning, Daniel went to the old locksmith shop at the end of the street to get a new key made for the back door, not because it was lost, but because the old key no longer seemed to fit the lock as it once did. The old locksmith Milton immediately asked, "Are you Mr. Keaton's son?" Daniel nodded. Milton scrutinized him for a moment, then said slowly, "I remember your father came in here to make a lock just like this one. He also said there was something wrong with the old key, even though the lock worked fine." Daniel fell silent. His father had gone through something similar, and he had never known? That afternoon, when he returned home, Daniel found Max lying still in the yard. The dog lifted its head, its eyes not glazed with sleep, but alert, tired. On the porch, there was a footprint, not a human's, not exactly a dog's. It was faint, long, and sharp, as though something alive, but not easily identified, had passed through. He grabbed a rag to wipe it away, but Max growled, not aggressively, but in protest. Daniel dropped the rag. Max stopped growling. The footprint remained. Daniel set the notebook on the table and quickly wrote, "If something entered the house without using the front door, then which entrance did I open?" That night, Kate dreamt of Daniel standing in front of the back door, yellow light spilling over his thin jacket. She called to him, but he didn't turn. He only spoke without looking. "If you notice I've changed, keep Max close. He knows how to bring people back. You don't need to follow." She woke in the middle of the night, her hands sweating. Daniel was sleeping soundly, but Max, lying at the foot of the bed, had his eyes wide open. He wasn't looking at Kate. He was staring out the window. The next morning, Daniel decided to open the back door for the first time since waking up. He didn't tell Kate. He just took a flashlight and slipped his notebook into his pocket. The door opened more easily than he remembered. The hinges didn't creak. Behind it was the small shed where they used to store tools, but now the wooden floor was thick with dust, except for one area marked with a trail, as though something had been dragged across it regularly. And against the wall was an old metal box. Inside the box was nothing but a folded piece of paper. Daniel opened it. The handwriting was scrawled. "Last time, you didn't have time to read it." At the bottom, in smaller writing, "Don't let Max go ahead of you." Daniel stepped outside, locked the door, and said nothing to Kate. But that night, Max didn't lie by the back door anymore. He lay by Daniel's bed. His eyes never left him. One morning, Daniel woke to find Max wasn't at the foot of the bed. Instead, the dog was standing motionless in front of the old desk. The sky was still dim. The clock read 6:47. Max didn't move. He just stood there. Daniel dressed and walked over. Max still didn't turn his head. When Daniel placed his hand on the dog's shoulder, Max finally raised his head and then turned away, returning to his spot as if nothing had happened. The same thing happened 2 days later. Exactly at 6:47 on the third morning, Daniel deliberately stayed in bed longer, until 7:05. Max wasn't at the desk anymore, but when Daniel went outside, the dog came in from the yard, passed by him, and walked right back to the desk. 6:47 had passed, but Max still came. He stood in the exact same spot, unmoving. This time, Daniel noticed, the spot where he stood was where his father used to sit to write his journal. A small scratch mark on the wooden floor was still there, the imprint of the old wooden chair scraping across the years. Max stood, perfectly aligned with that mark. Daniel didn't say anything. He simply returned to his room, opened his notebook, and wrote, "I've seen behavior like this before, but it wasn't from a dog." Kate, after days of silence, began to notice something else. Max no longer slept the way he used to. He didn't snore. He didn't shift positions. He didn't curl his legs. He lay exactly like a sentry, eyes half open, ears always turned toward the back door. One day, she moved the wooden chair where Max usually stood, moved it exactly 8 inches. The next day, Max didn't stand in that spot anymore. He walked past it, looked at it, then turned away. But when she put the chair back in its original place the next morning, Max returned. He stood exactly where he had before, she told Daniel. He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Maybe. He's trying to help me remember something I don't have the courage to recall." One afternoon, Daniel received a call from Marla, the nurse at the hospital. "Can you meet me? Just for a moment. I think there's something you need to see." They met at a small cafe at the edge of town. Marla was late, carrying a USB drive and a tablet. "This is the security footage from the night you woke up," she said. "I didn't dare send it to anyone. I didn't want to keep it at work." She played the video. Daniel watched without blinking. It was still the scene of Max touching his hand, but when she slowed it down to the right frame, he could clearly see the wall clock stopped for 1 second. The second hand froze, then it jumped ahead. That wasn't all. In the background noise, there was a slight distortion. Marla rewound. Inside it were 3 words, warped and repeated 3 times. "Don't let him come back." Daniel didn't react the way she expected. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't panicked. He just nodded very lightly. "Do you remember the smell from that night?" he asked. "The smell?" Marla frowned. "The smell in the ICU room when Max touched me." She paused for a few seconds, then quietly said, "Fresh lime, like when you strip old paint off a wall." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." She didn't understand why he thanked her, but as she left the cafe, Marla noticed her hands trembling. She had seen many things in her medical career, but to look in Daniel's eyes that day made her feel as though she'd been warned about something that hadn't. That evening, Daniel went home and rifled through his father's old wooden box. Inside, he found a stack of unsent letters. One of them was marked in red. He opened it, and there was only one sentence. "If I don't come back, don't search, but if I return, please ask me, what did I choose?" No date, no recipient, no sender. Daniel sat alone, reading that line over and over until midnight. The next night, the alarm clock went off at 3:42 a.m. Daniel turned it off and went back to sleep. But the next night, it rang again, still at 3:42, and the third night in a row. He replaced the batteries. It still rang at the same time. This time, he got up. Max wasn't at the foot of the bed. He was standing in the middle of the room, facing the window, like a guard. Daniel walked up to him. He didn't say anything, just placed his hand on Max's head, and in that moment, he could feel it clearly. Something was standing outside, not a person, not an animal, no movement, just a presence, a dense, thick stillness of waiting. Daniel opened his notebook and wrote the shortest line he'd ever written. "Next time, if I return and don't ask Max's name, don't let me stay." The next morning, Kate saw Daniel go out to the backyard, sitting in front of the lavender bush. He wasn't doing anything. He just sat there. She went out and asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah." "Are you looking for something?" "No. I think maybe someone sat here before me." "Who do you mean?" Daniel didn't answer. He just said, "I once dreamed I sat here, but I saw Max come out of the house, calling me by another name." Kate went silent. She wasn't sure which terrified her more, Daniel remembering, or the fact that he might no longer be Daniel at all. By the end of the day, Daniel stood in front of the mirror. He stared at his reflection for a long time, not to check for wrinkles or gray hair, but to make sure he was still here. Max stood behind him, unmoving. Daniel looked into his own eyes, then quietly asked, "Have you ever been with another Daniel?" Max didn't answer, but Daniel knew the truth. For 2 straight days, the sky over Grey Ridge had thickened into a heavy, suffocating gray, as though someone had forgotten to turn off the sky's switch, leaving a damp blanket to settle quietly over every rooftop. In the thick air, where silence was usually the rule, forgotten things began to remember each other, like the shattered clock still struggling to chime, like Max's shadow silently gliding across the porch without making a sound. Daniel grew more uneasy even though his body had recovered. There was something out of sync between his body and soul, as if this body was just a shell for a consciousness that had lost its way. He tried to tighten the loose armrest on the table, but the nails skewed. When he wrote, he unconsciously called out the names of the dead. When he drank coffee, a strange taste lingered, rust dull and persistent in his throat, mingling with the familiar bitterness. Kate, worried, called a doctor to check his mental state and run an EEG. The results were normal. "You're not sick," the doctor said. "You're just trying to remember something." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm forgetting, and that's the scary part." That night, Max stood still in front of the shed. The light inside flickered like someone had just unplugged and plugged it back in. Daniel switched on the flashlight and stepped outside. Max didn't stop him, he just followed, slowly. Inside the shed, the dim light revealed faint handprints on the walls, as though someone had once fumbled in the dark, searching for an escape. Daniel found an old cassette tape in a wooden box. Back home, he placed it in the machine and pressed play. After the crackling static, a hoarse male voice broke through, dusty with time. "If you forget, Max will remember for you, but you won't like what he remembers." The voice, The pauses, the weight, the familiarity was exactly like his father's. Max came and sat at his feet. The light flickered again. Then the strong smell of lime filled the air, familiar as a haunting. Daniel stood, looked into the mirror, and in it, he no longer saw himself. Instead, there was a man in old clothes, pale hands, with a name tag, Caleb Moore. "How many times have I forgotten?" he whispered. Max blinked. Outside, the sky over Grey Ridge flickered red, its first flash in weeks. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual, the pale light cast on the fogged-up mirror. He didn't change his shirt, didn't comb his hair. He simply stepped outside to the shed. Max was already there. No signal, no tail wag. Just standing like a person. Unmoving. All through the night. Daniel opened the shed door and stepped into the darkness. Max followed, its shadows stretching long over the rotting floorboards. In the corner, the old metal box was still there, untouched. Daniel opened it. Beneath the old paper was a burned photograph, a young man sitting in the garage, hugging Max. But that man wasn't Daniel. It was Caleb Moore. He turned to Max and quietly asked, "Did you live with this man?" Max didn't answer, but the look in its eyes made Daniel understand. This dog hadn't lived just one life. It had lived through many cycles of the same soul. Back home, Daniel placed the photo on the table and poured coffee. In that moment, he smelled the familiar scent of burning wood, the scent of the room in his dream, where a broken cord and a rusty lock sat. He opened his notebook and wrote, "If I'm not the first, then could this be the last?" Later that day, he walked around the backyard. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle, damp earth, and strangely motor oil. Near the end of the garden was a sunken patch of ground. Daniel dug. Beneath the soil was a thin tin box, inside a notebook with corners rotted away. The first page read, "Moore, 1993, Cycle 3. Isaac Guatemala." Daniel flipped through the pages. "Don't let Max lead the way. Don't fix machines on Saturdays. If you meet Hannah, don't touch." He shuddered. Max stepped closer. Daniel placed a hand on its head and asked, "Are you keeping me here, or keeping me from remembering?" Max didn't answer, but the look in its eyes seemed to confirm both. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The moon hung across the treetops like a scar on the sky. Max lay at his feet, just like before, but this time, Daniel told a story, not to Max, but to himself. "I remember standing before this door, holding the broken clock. My father said, 'If you don't know the time, don't step forward.' But I did. And that time, I didn't look back. Until Max found me." He looked at Max, gently. "You're the only dog I've ever had. But this isn't the first time I've said this, is it?" Max stretched. Didn't bark. Didn't growl. But a cold breeze swept through the porch, as if time had contracted for a moment. The next morning, Kate found Daniel repainting the shed door in silver gray, the color of his father's old garage. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm blocking something." "What?" Daniel thought for a moment before replying. "Something that, if opened, would mean I'm no longer the person you know." Kate didn't ask any more questions. She simply watched him, then turned away, eyes misted with tears, though she didn't know why. Max stood watch in the corner of the porch. That night, the wind howled. The window panes rattled. The kitchen clock stopped at 2:47. Daniel woke up. Max wasn't in the room. The shed door stood wide open. He ran outside. Max was there, standing exactly where the tape had once been. On the table was a new piece of paper. "If you remember this time, don't close the door. Open it and let Max decide." Daniel read it, then burned the paper. The ashes flew away with the wind, and he knew the new cycle had begun. Outside, Grey Ridge slept, but beneath the town's moist soil, something had begun to stir. The weather in Grey Ridge took a sudden chill on Monday morning. The clouds parted like cotton strands being torn apart, revealing thin, pale sunlight like an old tablecloth. But despite the clearer sky, Daniel still felt something lingering, not in the air, but within him. Max no longer stayed close by his side as before. It didn't leave, just maintained a certain distance, exactly 3 steps, as though following some mysterious ritual only it understood. Every time Daniel turned around, Max stood still, its eyes locked on something behind him. Daniel started writing everything down, not in any order, without thought. The notes piled up as though trying to hold on to the fragments of memory slipping away. Among them, he wrote, "The wind chimes on the porch never sound when I'm home alone, but yesterday they rang 3 times. Or, Max dreams. I'm sure of it. It scratches the floor when it sleeps, not chasing dreams, but falling dreams. And I once held this clock, but it's not mine." One day, Kate brought in an old box she found while cleaning out the shed in the back. Inside were a few books, some old photographs, and a birthday card addressed to Caleb Moore. "I thought it was for someone else," Kate said, "but the handwriting, it's yours." Daniel picked up the card. The ink had smeared, but the words were still clear. "Happy 7th. Don't forget. Always be the last to turn off the lights." He didn't remember writing that, but his chest tightened, as if part of an old memory was knocking at the door, waiting for him to open it. The following week, Max started barking at exactly 4:13 a.m. every day. It wasn't a long, drawn-out bark, just one sharp bark, and then silence. Daniel checked the camera outside on the porch. The footage showed. Exactly at 4:13, the motion lights came on, but no one was there, yet Max's shadow always turned toward the east. He tried placing clocks in different spots around the house. Strangely, they all stopped at 4:13 if he slept in the living room. But if he slept upstairs, the clocks worked fine. He flipped through the notebook his father had left. The last page was written in faded blue ink. "Don't sleep in the living room after seeing the second light." From then on, Max began stepping back whenever Daniel tried to open the back door. Once it growled, not out of fear, but in protest. Daniel stepped back, the back door slammed shut, though there was no wind. On Saturday, as the sky turned to rain, Daniel realized he was standing in the middle of the room with an old flashlight in his hand. He didn't remember why he was holding it. Max looked at him, silent, as if waiting. Daniel switched on the light. The beam illuminated a faint, circular mark on the wall, as though there had once been a clock hanging there. But in his memory, this house had never had a wall clock. He stepped closer, and the flashlight revealed silver ink, only visible under the beam. "If you've seen this, it means the cycle is entering its final stage. Tell Max not to lead anyone new anymore." That night, Daniel dreamed he was no longer a man. He had no hands, no face, just a shadow standing by the window looking out at the field. Max was also a shadow sitting next to him, though clearer. When Daniel turned to him, Max spoke in a human voice. It was Daniel's voice. "We weren't made to come back, but if we do, we must remember why." Daniel woke up, his forehead drenched in sweat. Max lay beside him, unmoving, but its eyes were still open. The next morning, Daniel stepped out onto the porch and set a blank piece of paper on fire. The ashes spiraled up, twisting into a circle. He watched them rise and whispered, "This time, I will go all the way, and if I don't come back, let the next person read everything I've written." Max lifted its head, then turned its eyes away from him, for the first time in days. After the thunderstorm that night, something strange happened. The wind chimes on the porch stopped ringing, even though the wind was strong. Max no longer barked at 4:13 a.m. Everything became eerily quiet, so much so that it unnerved Daniel. It wasn't peace, it felt like a pause, like the town, the house, and he himself were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Max changed too. It began sitting by the door every evening at sunset, staring down the dirt road leading into town. One early morning, Daniel heard a knock at the door. 3 sharp, steady taps, like the sound of Max's claws tapping on the wooden floor. But Max was sitting inside the room. Daniel went out but saw no one. There was only a wet footprint on the cement floor. The print was large, the toes unclear, resembling either a claw mark or a hand that had been stretched out. He knelt down and wrote the final line in his notebook for the day. "Something has come." But it didn't knock to ask to come in. It knocked to remind me I've already opened the door for it. The next afternoon, Kate went to the backyard and saw Max scratching lightly at the earth beneath the old eucalyptus tree. It wasn't digging deeply, just brushing aside the decaying leaves to reveal a small metal piece. Daniel walked over. It was an old brass nameplate, rusted, engraved with the words, "Caleb Moore, 19732015. Kate looked at Daniel, her eyes wide. "You had a grave here?" Daniel didn't answer. He just bent down and picked up the nameplate. On the back there was a small inscription. "If you read this, keep moving, but don't move alone." He clenched it in his hand. Max sat beside him, breathing softly. The wind began to pick up, the first time in many days of stillness. That afternoon, Grey Ridge's air thickened with humidity, as if the rain had fallen but never quite reached the ground. Daniel sat in his office, the brass nameplate resting on his desk. He stared at it as though it were a mirror, not because it reflected, but because it reminded him of something he hadn't yet had the courage to remember. Max lay at his feet, but not asleep. Its eyes were open, watching Daniel's every move. That gaze was no longer just loyalty. It was the quiet watchfulness of a creature that had seen coming back far too many times. Daniel opened his notebook, but instead of writing, he flipped through the early pages. The first page, where he thought he had started writing, wasn't his handwriting. The strokes were sharp, rigid, and slanted to the left. Caleb Moore's handwriting. The first line read, "This is Cycle 4. If you're me, don't try to remember everything. Just don't forget Max." His heart raced. He continued reading. "Each time I return, I leave a mark. But by the third time, I lost myself between the marks. Max doesn't. It's the rhythm. It's the lock. It's the way back." Daniel closed the notebook. Max was still there, eyes never leaving him. Outside, the wind chimes rang. No wind. No one touched them. That evening, Kate said she wanted to clean out the attic. "Just clearing some old stuff," she said. Daniel didn't object. But as she stepped upstairs, Max stiffened. "What's that?" Daniel asked. Max stepped toward the attic door, growling softly. Suddenly, Daniel remembered something. In his father's journal, there had been a note that read, "Don't let anyone go upstairs unless Max goes first." At the time, he'd thought his father was just rambling, but now he walked over. Kate was opening the door to the room. "Wait!" he called out loudly. She turned, slightly surprised. "What is it?" she asked. "Let Max go first." Max looked up at him, then it stepped forward. Not hastily, step by step, as if testing the memories beneath each floorboard. The attic was dim, filled with the smell of old wood and decaying paper. In the corner stood an old, locked metal cabinet. Max stopped in front of it, not barking, just staring. Daniel found the key in the toolbox his father had left behind. The lock clicked open easily. Inside there wasn't furniture but a stack of papers, an old cassette tape, and a broken photo frame. The frame fell out first, its glass shattered, the photo faded. It was Daniel, or someone who looked like him, standing next to Max. But Max in the photo looked exactly the same. Not older, not different. Kate looked at the photo, then at Max. "When was this?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer. His hands were trembling. He flipped through the papers. The top one was a medical report naming Caleb Moore. Date of death, 2015. Cause, cardiac arrest following an unexplained respiratory accident. Signed by Dr. Harold Keaton. Daniel's father, below, was a name change request. From Caleb Moore to Daniel Keaton. Daniel didn't remember ever doing that. But the signature at the bottom was his. For many days after that he said nothing, didn't write. He just sat on the porch, watching Max, and Max, unlike before, didn't urge him on. One evening, Daniel asked Max, "How many times have you been here?" Max didn't answer, but a cold wind swept through, carrying the rustling sound of dry leaves. Daniel closed his eyes. In his mind, a recurring image played, a long, pale hallway where he stood beside him, Max, and each door along the wall opened to a different memory. There was one door that was always slightly ajar. He had never dared open it, but this time, Max walked toward it, stopped in front of it, looked at him, then scratched lightly. Daniel reached out and opened it. The next morning, he woke to find his hand marked with an unfamiliar blue ink, not from writing, but something like an imprint, a circular shape with two intertwined letters in the center, M/D. He looked down at the notebook. The last page from yesterday now had a new line, not written by him. "If you've opened the last door, don't write any more. Live or go, but don't let Max choose another." Max looked up at him. Its eyes no longer belonged to a dog, but to one who had been waiting through 4 cycles. Daniel sighed, then closed the notebook. For the first time in many months, he didn't take the notebook out to the porch. Instead, he took a ceramic bowl, filled it with water, and placed it in front of Max. The dog drank a sip, then looked up at him, as if confirming that something had finally been done right. That day, the sky over Grey Ridge didn't rain, but the ground was soaked, as if it had just been washed clean, preparing for a new chapter. After breakfast that day, Daniel decided to clean out his father's old office, the room he had avoided since his father's death. Max walked beside him, step by step, not rushing. The room smelled of old books, leather, and sun-warmed wood. On the floor, beneath a worn rug, was a loose floorboard. Daniel pried it up. Beneath it was a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside was a strange device, like a tape recorder, but with a small CRT screen integrated. Next to it was a leather-bound notebook that read, "Forwarding notes. Only open when Max agrees." Max looked at him. Didn't bark. Didn't protest. Daniel opened the notebook. The first line read, "Each cycle, one person will keep the rhythm. That person doesn't have to understand. Just don't let go. If you're reading this, it's time to pass it on." He read on. Descriptions of cycles, the repetition, the loss of memory. How memories reconstructed with each season, each action. And at the end, a list of names. Some crossed out in red, some circled. The last name, Daniel Keaton, Cycle 4, not yet chosen. His hands shook. Max moved closer, gently nudging his leg. Daniel collapsed into a chair, gasping. In that moment he understood. It wasn't Max protecting him from something outside. It was protecting him from his own memories. When night fell, Daniel placed the notebook in the desk drawer, locking it. He poured a cup of tea, sitting next to Max on the porch, looking out at the front yard. For the first time in many months, he felt peaceful, but also afraid, because this peace felt like standing in front of a doorway that hadn't yet been named. Max gently licked his hand, then nestled his head in Daniel's lap. The sky over Grey Ridge darkened, no moon. But the wind whispered from the distant woods, the sound of things old, repeating in a different way. That afternoon, the air in Grey Ridge was no longer thick like before. Instead, a pale sunlight pierced through the silver clouds, casting its light on the wet ground, as though the town had just exhaled a long, deep breath. Daniel woke early. No dreams, no startles. Simply opened his eyes and saw that Max was already there, as if waiting for him to wake up and begin something new. That day, Daniel didn't take his notebook. He didn't need to write anything down. He wore his oldest coat, the shoes still covered in dirt from the garden, and walked out of the house with Max. He didn't leave a note for Kate. Didn't say a word. They walked down the dirt road leading to the old workshop on the outskirts of town, the first garage of Caleb Moore. Now only part of the roof remained, and a broken metal sign lay precariously on a moss-covered wall. Daniel stopped in front of the workshop's back door. Max stepped forward, automatically veering left, heading toward a crooked bush, then scratching lightly at the earth. Daniel knelt beside him. Beneath the decaying leaves, a small brass plate gradually revealed itself, engraved with the words, "Each keeper of the rhythm must choose to stay or to let the cycle end." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them, looking at Max and asking, "How many people have you seen come here?" Max didn't answer. He simply sat down, his eyes locked on Daniel, not urging, not advising, just like a mirror, reflecting what Daniel was ready to face. Daniel stood, pulled from his coat pocket the key his father had left behind, the one he thought he had lost. The workshop's lock opened easily, as if it had been oiled every week by someone. Inside, it wasn't as dark as he had imagined. Light filtered through the cracks in the broken walls. On the back wall was a wooden pegboard still intact, with each hook holding an old name tag. Some rusty, some missing. At the bottom, a tag with the name D. Keaton hung on a hook that was still whole. Daniel took it down, holding it in his hand. On the back, there was a small engraving. "If you remember who you are, then this is the last time." He turned to Max, his voice low. "This time, you don't need to keep me here anymore." Max remained sitting, his gaze softer, as if a companion had finally been allowed to rest after a long journey. Daniel returned home in the late afternoon. Kate was sitting on the porch, reading through the notes he had written. Beside her was the metal box from the attic, now open. She looked up, worry in her eyes. "Where did you go?" "I went to the old place," he answered. "The place where I was first begun." "And are you planning to end there?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "No, I just wanted to put everything back in its place." That night, he placed the notebook, the notes, and the name tag in a wooden box. On the lid, he affixed a label, "For the next one." Max was no longer lying by the door. He had returned to his familiar spot at the foot of the bed. Daniel lay down, closed his eyes. In his dreams, he saw a long, white corridor, but this time, the last door had opened. The light from within spilled out gently, not to call him, but to send him on. Inside that room, there was nothing but a wooden chair, and Max, young, stronger, curled up next to it. Daniel sat down beside him, saying nothing, and he knew that, this time, he no longer needed to keep watch. The next morning, Kate woke up. Daniel was still sleeping, his breathing steady, but Max was gone. No footprints, No sound of the door opening, just an empty bowl, clean, spotless. She stepped out onto the porch. The sky in Grey Ridge was clear, no wind, no rain, and the color of the sky as though no past had ever been here. Appreciate you staying with us. Not everyone gets to hear the untold. If this intrigued you, drop a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to The Untold Story to uncover even more.